In this video, I'm going to show you how I begin drawing a portrait from life. My model is seated about 5 or 6 feet away from the easel, and we have some nice natural light in here. I'm using pan pastel for this initial stage, and I'm using a pan pastel soft tool with a pointed number 4 cover. Using straight lines, I begin by mapping out the outside edges of my model. Using straight quick lines, I copy the angles I see along the top of her head. I map out the back of her head and try to determine the approximate shape of her skull. I'm going to begin marking the opposite side of her head. I'm establishing the angle of her face, and I'm holding up my pan pastel tool, lining it up with the angle that I see along that side of her cheek. And then I'm moving my hand over to the paper and literally copying that exact angle. I'm mapping out the angle of the chin, and again, trying to establish that jawline. Mapping out the neck, the lines of her neck. And I'm beginning to establish the angles that I see along the neckline of her shirt. I'm going to move over to the opposite side of her neck and begin establishing the angles I see around her shoulder. These are just really loose lines, and I'm not going to worry about how messy they are. They'll blend in with the drawing later on. I'm going to lightly establish the curve around the shoulder. I'm looking at the angles that I see along the outside edge of her hair. With a live model, the hair changes at every break, so I don't put any details at this point. I'm just simply trying to map out how her hair falls down around her shoulder, over her chest, kind of roughly laying in the shapes that I see. I'm going to be establishing the angles that I see up around her eye and where her cheek meets the eye, which is really important in the 3/4 pose. This is one of the most difficult areas, is getting those angles correct and maintaining a distance between her nose and that side of her face. So I'm holding up my tool and trying to match those angles properly. And I'm going to come over and copy or duplicate that angle on the paper to try to establish the proper angle along that eye. I'm bringing in a straight line straight down the face. This is marking the end of her nose. The end of her nose will touch that line. Because I want to pay special attention to the distance between the end of her nose and the side of her cheek. Now I'm beginning to examine the angles of her nose, and I put those in there very lightly. And I'm marking that angle along the eye, and again the angle of the cheek where it meets the eye. Now I'm establishing the bottom edge of the nose, where the placement should be, and I'm looking at the shapes I see along the bottom of her nose and trying to put those in very lightly. Just establish the overall shape and angles. This line represents the angle of the eyes. The eyes are going to set directly on that line. Now I can establish the angle along the edge of her nose, and I'm going to loosely start to define the eye sockets. I just want to map in the overall shape of the eye socket and put in a dark shadow that represents the overall placement of the eye socket. I don't go into any detail at this point. I'm just mapping things out, getting the placement down. Now I'm going to start establishing some of the shadow shapes that I see within the face. and I'm going to copy down the shape of those shadows. So if I see a darkened triangle on the model, I'm going to come over and try to duplicate that exact triangular shape on my drawing, and then I'm going to darken it. Now I'm establishing more of the hairline, how it curves around the ear, and I'm going to map out the placement of the ear in relationship to the nose. I'm always checking the relationship or distance between one feature and another. Again, I'm hopping around, moving back to the hair, establishing more of those lines and angles that outline the hair, the mass of hair. Coming back into the face, and again looking at those shadow shapes. I'm going to move in and establish a line at the mouth. I'm double checking my angles. I want the angle of my eyes, the angle at the bottom of the nose, and the angle of the mouth to be all parallel. And all of those should be parallel to the chin line. So you always want to double check your angles. You double check the angle of the chin, the mouth line, the nose, and the eyes. I'm establishing the shapes that I see in the chin, those shadow shapes. And I'm just kind of loosely outlining them with my pan pencil tool. I'm going to come back in and fill those in with dark, lightly fill those in with dark, to begin creating those shadows. But first I want to establish what the actual shadow shape is. What is the outside border shape of those areas? I'm going to kind of loosely lay that in. Then I'll use the bottom of my pan pastel tool and lightly fill it in with some dark. Now I'm moving back up to the forehead, establishing those shadow shapes I see on the forehead. And I'm correcting the hairline angles, double checking them again. Checking the angle where her hair meets her forehead. Going to start laying in some dark areas in the hair. And I'm going to establish the angle of her part, of the part in her hair. Try to lay that in. I'm looking at the hair at where it separates so I can create different separate masses of hair and just kind of determine the shapes of those masses so I can put in the outline of those masses and then darken in those areas where I see darks within her hair. I see a real dark area along her neck and her chin, so I'm going to go ahead and lay that in the hair using the bottom of the pan pastel tool to lay in my darks. Later on, I'll lift out lights with my kneaded eraser. Right now, I'm just going to try to lightly add some depth and dark to her hair. Double checking the angles of her hairline again as her hair meets her forehead. What those shapes are. I'm just going to map out those shapes. Look for areas of dark and put in those shadow shapes. And I'm going to darken most of her hair. The only areas I'm going to leave open or light are the highlight areas. Now I'm going to establish the shapes that I see and the shadow shapes that I see along her neck. I'm going to determine what those shapes look like what shape they are. I'm going to map those in and lightly darken them. That's about it for this stage. This is how I begin drawing a portrait from life. Check out the next video if you'd like to see the next few steps.